Hello everyone, welcome to Life on Planet Earth. I am Dr. Engohang-Ndong, your instructor. Now, as you can see, I am in a forest. And the reason why I'm in a forest is because I wanted to start this course of Life on Planet Earth in the context of living things around me. And you can see you have a diversity. These living things interact with each other. How are they interacting with each other? Right? How are they interacting with their environment? And very importantly, you as a human being, how are you interacting with your environment? That interaction can be positive, it can be negative, it can be neutral, right? But very importantly, what is your role in the environment where you live? So as we go through this journey of life on planet Earth, remember that we are trying to understand the interactions, the dynamic interaction that goes on between organisms among themselves and with their environment. And we also want to know, well, how are these organisms organized? Can we look at these organisms at the different levels of organs, of tissues, of cells, and how are cells made up of? And how does the cell work anyway, right? So these are a few things I want you to keep in mind. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the first chapter. The first chapter will focus on biology as the science of life. As we cover this chapter, there are few aspects I would like you to focus on. First and foremost, what do we call life? So what are the characteristics of life? Then we are going to check or dive into how living systems are connected with each other. Is there a connection when we look at the history of life between all living things, right? This is going to lead us to evolution, that is going to allow us to dive in the concept of descent with modification. So we trust that all living systems, in spite of the wide diversity, are somehow connected by a common ancestor. So descent is the concept of unity, and modification is the concept of diversity. We are going to take a look at that. And then we're going to ask the following question: how do we study life? What are the approaches that we use to acquire knowledge about living systems? The way they interact with each other, the way they interact with their environment, right? So that is going to lead us to science, which is a way to acquire knowledge. And finally, for this chapter, we are going to address the challenges that we still have in science, things we still need to understand, right? And the way we go about understanding this thing is still going to be the same approach. Nevertheless, we still have to understand these challenges of today. All right, so let's move on. So our first step is to define life, right? What is life? We notice that living organisms in our environment on Earth are very diverse. So here on this slide, you see the diversity of life. We have some bacteria, which are single-cell organisms. We have fungi, and this very particular instance, a mushroom, which is a multicellular organism. We have a plant here, a sunflower, multicellular organism, and we have a human, which is also a multicellular organism. So life is going to cause us to look at biodiversity, which is the diversity among living systems. Now, as we look at that diversity of life, we notice that they all share a common organization. All living systems, for instance, are made up of cells, right? And the way cells are organized is similar across living organisms, right? Now, obviously, you are going to have differences, but these differences are going to be also subject of some specific studies. Now, beyond that, there are characteristics that are very specific to living organisms. What are these characteristics? Well, we are going to focus on 7 characteristics. The first characteristic we want to focus on is that life is organized in levels. I told you about the cell. Some multicellular organisms are made up of organs. Organs are going to come together to form organ system. So we can take a look at different levels. When we look at many organisms together, we are going to ask, are these organisms the same in terms of species, or are they different in terms of species, right? These are all levels of organizations of life. We are going to take a look at some more details in a minute. We notice that all living systems, regardless of what they are going to need to acquire material for from their environment. That's why you, for instance, you need to eat, right? From that material, they are going to use energy to fuel the processes that are happening in the cell, in the organism. Then we notice that all living organisms, regardless, have to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. We call this homeostasis, right? And all living organisms should be able to respond to their environment, right? For instance, when it's cold, do you respond to that low temperature? Are dogs able to respond to low temperature? Microorganisms, plants, right? If so, how are they doing that, right? Then we're going to talk about adaptation. That adaptation is going to base on environment, right? Organisms that live in Ohio are going to be adapted to living in Ohio because the conditions in Ohio are just different from the conditions that you would find, for instance, in Utah or in Colorado, right? Or Montana. The conditions are not the same. And the organisms are going to thrive where they are suited to live, right? Where they are likely to produce offsprings and perpetuate their genes. That's another story that we are going to address. All living organisms have to be able to reproduce. They have to be able to grow and develop. And finally, all living organisms, as they are organized in population, are going to change over time. Organisms in a population are genetically diverse. That genetic diversity causes some of them to adapt differently over a long period of time. We call this evolution, so that we can literally see that, well, over a long period of time, organisms are changing because of the need to adapt to their environment as the environment changes. So remember these different characteristics of life, and now we are going to dive into each of them one at a time. So organisms are organized, right? They are very organized. That organization, when we zoom in an organism, is going to be similar, particularly when we consider multicellular organisms. In multicellular organisms, well, obviously, many cells are going to make one organism. Now, you have some organisms that are unicellular organisms, so one single cell makes up the organism. But in the case of multicellular organisms, we are going to see that cells come together to form more complex structures that we call tissues. But before we dive into that aspect, let's first of all say that the cell is the smallest structure of life that carries all the characteristics of life, meaning a cell is very organized, a cell needs nutrients, a cell needs energy, a cell needs to respond to environmental stimuli, needs to adapt, needs to reproduce, needs to evolve, right? So we say that the cell is the basic unit of life because it carries all the characteristics of life. Now, in multicellular organisms, cells are going to come together to form tissues. Tissues are similar cells that come together for a very specific function they need to fulfill. Then, tissues are going to come together to form a complex structure that is going to work toward a very specific function. For instance, in your body, you have a liver that is part of the digestive tract. But in the digestive tract, the liver being an organ, it's different from the pancreas. That is another organ of the digestive system, right? The tongue, it's another organ of the digestive system. The tongue, the pancreas, the liver, they don't play the same role in the digestive system, right? So now, organs are going to come together to form organ systems, okay? These organ systems are made up of, organs that work together toward the same goal. And then organ systems all together are going to make up an organism, right? Which is basically more complex than the individual structures, right? So the organ systems are going to come together, work together to make an organism that is properly functioning. Now, when we look at the levels of organization of biology, we can actually go from the most inclusive level of organization of biological system to the most exclusive level of organization of biological system. Now, the most inclusive level of organization is going to be the biosphere, right? The biosphere, it's everywhere on Earth life can be found. It can be on the terrestrial environment or in aquatic environment. But everywhere life is found on Earth, it's part of the biosphere, right? But then, within biospheres, the biosphere, we are going to have ecosystems. These ecosystems are going to be made up of different kind of organisms interacting with each other. These different kind of organisms make up communities, right? And these communities are interacting with each other, but also with their environment that is made up of non-living components, right? Okay? So the physical environment. Now, within ecosystems, when we focus on living things, we are going to have communities. And communities are made up of populations. Now, if you look at this picture here, we are going to have humans, trees, grass, and here we're going to have a zebra, trees, grass. So these different species interact with each other in what we call in biology a community. Then we can zoom in every single species and found that many organisms of the same species living in a given geographical area make up what we call a population. Okay? And the next level of organization, it's organism. Within a population, we are going to have single organisms, right? For instance, in a human population, one person is an organism, right? In a forest like the one I'm in here right now, you have one particular tree is going to be an organism, right? Now, populations are going to be defined based on a species, right? And what we call species in biology, it's organisms that are able to interbreed and reproduce, leave behind offsprings that themselves are going to be fertile and be able to produce other organisms, right? That's what we are going to call species at a biological level. And this is where we are going to focus, right? Now, zooming now inside the organism, we are going to find more components. These more components are going to be organ systems, right? And we already define organ systems as being a collection of organs that work together toward a particular function. For instance, in a human, the nervous system is an organ system. In a tree, a shoot system is an organ system. And now we can zoom a little more in the organ system and find the organs. In this very instance here for the human, we have the brain. In the shoot system, we do have leaves, right? Each leaf is an organ. Now, within the organ, we are going to have tissues, right? And the tissues, again, are collection of cells that work toward the same function. So for the brain, the nervous tissue, it's going to be a collection of nerve cells, right? The nerve cells, these are at the cellular level. While for the leaf, we have the leaf tissue. The leaf tissue is going to be made up of plant cells. And if we zoom in the cell, whether we are talking about the nerve cell or a plant cell, well, guess what? We are going to land on molecules. Molecules being a combination of atoms that make up the different elements that are found in nature. There are many different occurring elements. As these atoms come together, they form molecules. The complexity of molecules is what causes the body to exist, right? So we have an example here, methane. It's a molecule, right? Oxygen, it's an element, right? That oxygen is made up of atoms called atoms of oxygens, right? So we talked about the levels of organizations of life. Now, let's take a look at how all living systems need nutrients and energy. Now, how do they obtain nutrients? They obtain nutrients by ingesting food, right? This otter is actually enjoying some clams, okay? It's enjoying some clams to obtain nutrients after digesting the food. And through the metabolic process, that these nutrients are going to be broken down to produce energy. That energy is essential to run the metabolic processes in the body. And these metabolic processes are reactions of synthesis and reactions of hydrolysis. Synthesis, it's building up. Hydrolysis, it's breaking down, right? All these reactions of synthesis and hydrolysis fall within the umbrella of metabolism. Metabolism, it's all the reactions of synthesis and hydrolysis that occur in a cell or in a living organism, right? Now, regardless of the form of energy that we use, all the forms of energy that we use can be traced back to sun energy. Why? Because at the basis of all ecosystems, you have producers, and these producers have to obtain energy from the sun. And through a process that we call photosynthesis, producers are going to bring inorganic chemicals together, including carbon dioxide and water, to form sugars. And these sugars are going to further undergo some complex modifications, so that at the end of the day, you have production of more complex molecules, including proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. So, in our environment where living organisms exist, we notice that there is a flow of chemicals or nutrients and a flow of energy. Now, that flow of nutrients and energy is essential to maintain life and to maintain our environment going the way it goes within an equilibrium, right? So I want you to remember and to know that the chemicals in an ecosystem cycle. The chemicals do not live an ecosystem, they cycle, right? While energy flows, right? Energy flows between organisms, chemical cycle between organisms and the environment. I want you to remember that. Now, when we look closely at this picture on the left-hand side, we have, in terms of energy, the red represents energy. Now, energy that is found in an ecosystem can be traced back to the sun. The sun releases energy. That energy is captured by plants, algae, that are going to be photosynthetic, right? These are producers. These producers are going to capture sun energy. That energy that is captured is going to be used to to create material that cause the plant to exist, to grow, to reproduce, and so on. Now, some of the energy, though, that is captured from the sun is released as heat. Now, then the producers will have to be consumed by other organisms that rely on them. As they are consumed by other organs that rely on them, those organisms are called consumers. Those consumers that obtain energy from producers actually are going to convert some of the energy into the very chemicals that make up the body of the consumer, but eventually other part of the energy is released as heat, right? So much that what is left in the consumer, it's only going to be the fraction of what they obtain initially. And eventually the consumer is going to die, giving off energy for the decomposers to enjoy, grow, and reproduce. Some of the energy that is consumed is actually going to be released as heat. Now, what we notice here is that as we go from producers to consumers to decomposers, energy flows one way. In an ecosystem, you have a unidirectional flow of energy. I want you to remember that, okay? As a matter of fact, I will test you on that. I want you to also know that when it comes to chemicals, chemicals always cycle in an ecosystem. How so? Producers are providing chemicals to consumers. When these consumers die, the consumers are actually going to give off these chemicals to the decomposers. After decomposing the chemicals that were in the consumers, these chemicals go in the ground, and these chemicals are now going to be used again by producers so that they can be used as raw material for the body, the matter that is in producers to exist, right? So, in an ecosystem, you have a constant cycling of chemicals and a unidirectional flow of energy. These are the two things that maintains an ecosystem in balance. If there is loss of a component of an ecosystem, that balance is going to change. For instance, in this particular ecosystem right here, we have this rabbit that is a consumer, right? If the rabbit is extinct, the role the rabbit was playing in that ecosystem is not played anymore. As a consequence of that, the chemicals that the rabbit consumed or used to handle is not being part of the ecosystem anymore, which means that the system has to change, because some organisms dependent on the rabbit for their life, right? With the rabbit being absent now from the ecosystem, well, the consumer of rabbit will have two choices. One is to adapt to new types of food. Two is to go extinct, okay? All right. So living organisms have to respond to their environment. Think a minute. When it's cold, what happens to you? When it's warm, hot, what happens to you, right? Our body is set at a very specific temperature. In our case, human, our stable environment inside, it's at 37 degrees Celsius. If it is too hot outside, our inner system is going to feel it. Now, how so? In your skin, you have some receptors of temperature that are going to sense that it is hot. They send the information in the brain through an afferent pathway. That afferent pathway is some kind of highways that send the information in the brain. The brain treats the information, compares the temperature that is being communicated to the cell to the set temperature, and the brain is going to make the decision that, it's hot outside, let us cool the body down. Then the information is going to be sent to effector organs, and these effector organs are going to receive that information through efferent pathways. Now, as the effector receive the information, they are going to respond by, in this particular instance, the sweat glands are going to be activated. When the sweat glands are activated, we are going to start sweating, right? There is a film of water that's going to go on top of the skin, and this is going to be enough to break the heat and to cool the body down. Similarly, if it's too cold outside, the temperature of the body will tend to go down. We are just leaving winter. We are in the spring right now, and pretty soon we're going to get in the summer, right? So when it was cold in the winter and we went out, well, our skin would feel that it is cold. So the receptor in our skin are going to send the information in the brain via an afferent pathway, right? In the brain is going to notice that, well, there is a major change in temperature. So we need to develop a response. And what is that response? Well, that response is that the body will start shivering, right? The muscles are going to contract, they produce heat, and that heat is what allows your body to come back, to bring back the temperature to what it needs to be, right? And this, we call this homeostasis, all right? So homeostasis is very important to maintain a relatively stable internal environment, right? Eventually, movement in some organisms can also develop to maintain homeostasis. All right, living organisms have to be adapted to thrive in their environment. Without that adaptation, they cannot survive. They cannot leave behind offsprings. That adaptation, it's going to be a set of modifications, right, that make an organism suitable to live in their environment. For instance, in Colorado, where it is hot during summer times, right? And Colorado being a desert, there is not enough water in there. And it is not just sometimes that there is not enough water in Colorado, it's almost all the time. If you go to Las Vegas, you go on the west coast, on the west side of the United States, you're going to see a lot of areas where water is just scarce. There is not as much water as in Ohio. So the organisms that live there, the cacti for instance, they have to be adapted to live in that environment, or else they cannot survive, right? So let me take you an example of birds, including ox. The ox, actually there are different kind of oxes. These oxes, some of them are suited to catch fish. They are very good at that. They have adapted to catch fish and to rely on fish diet, while others are adapted to eat rabbits because that's what they know best how to get as source of food. They evolved that way, right? So the rabbit catchers are not going to pretend that they are fish catchers. No, they cannot, because they don't have the features for that, right? Now, in terms of humans, we also observe the same thing. People who live in high elevation, for instance, in areas such as Himalaya, right, are going to be characterized by the fact that they have a reduced amount of hemoglobin in the blood. Why do they have a reduced amount of hemoglobin in the blood? Because we notice that when we go in high altitude, there is a decreased amount of oxygen. Our body, in terms of homeostasis, will try to compensate for this by causing us to produce a lot of blood cells. But here is the thing. Because I live in Ohio and go to Himalaya, if I go there, my body is going to produce a bunch of red blood cells. Now, that increase in the amount of red blood cells is going to cause my blood to become thick. And by becoming thick, my heart is going to work much harder. So much harder that I can actually die. Okay? That's what happens, right? When you have too much blood in your blood, too much red blood cells in your blood, right? The blood thickens. Now, for populations who are living all the time in high altitude because that's just where they live and thrive. They have to have a reduced amount of hemoglobin. So we are adapted differently, right? Based on where we live. Now, living organisms have to be able to reproduce, grow, and develop. So if you consider bacteria, for instance, bacteria multiply by a process that we call binary fission. In other words, the organism grows and then splits in two, which, by the way, allows bacteria to grow in an exponential manner. The population, I mean, right? Because growth in bacteria has nothing to do with growth in a human, right? You grow. When a bacterium grows, we cannot see the actual organism growing. What we can see, however, is the population growth. That's why when it comes to bacteria, when we talk about growth, we talk about population, which is not the same thing as talking about growth when it comes to a deer, when it comes to a cat, a dog, a human, right? Multicellular, however, they are going to have a different way of reproducing. In multicellular organisms, typically, eggs are going to be encountered by sperm cells, and the sperm cells are going to fertilize eggs. As sperm cells fertilize eggs, they end up forming a zygote. That zygote is going to develop into an embryo. That embryo is going to further develop into a fetus, and the fetus is going to develop into a perfect organism, right? Now, all these processes, what the organism look like, how they respond to their environment, can boil down to DNA, okay? The DNA structure, the genes that are contained in DNA, it's what determines what organisms is what and how do they respond to their environment. Without these genes, forget about adaptation to environment, right?